There are objects that carry more than their own weight. Not in the mystical sense of haunted things or cursed things or the objects of folklore that pulse with borrowed power. In the simpler and more honest sense of things that have been held by enough hands for long enough that they have accumulated, in their material surface, a kind of record, of the holding, of the using, of the specific human intentions that moved through them across time. A worn wooden handle. A letter folded so many times that the creases have become permanent geography. A photograph whose edges have been touched into softness by years of being picked up and put down and picked up again. Things that are, in their physical reality, just things, and that are, in their human reality, considerably more than things. A key is this kind of object more than almost any other. A key is, by its nature, about potential. About what lies on the other side of something. About the gap between locked and open, between outside and inside, between the life you are living and the life that waits behind the door that the key fits. A key is a promise in metal. And an old key, a key whose door may no longer exist, whose lock may have been changed or whose house may have been sold or demolished or transformed into something unrecognizable, is a promise that has outlasted its original context and that carries, in the unlocking it can no longer perform, everything that the original promise meant. This is a story about an old key. And about what it opened. And about how the thing it opened had nothing to do with any door. The woman who found the key was named Vera. She was 52 years old and she was in the middle of the specific and unglamorous process of clearing her mother's house following her mother's death, a process that is simultaneously practical and devastating in a way that the practical does not prepare you for and that the devastating does not prevent you from having to complete. Her mother had been gone for 3 weeks. The house needed to be sorted and sold. These were facts. Facts do not pause for grief, and Vera was not the kind of person who expected them to. She was practical in the way that capable, self-sufficient women of her generation had learned to be practical, not by the suppression of feeling but by the coexistence of feeling and function, by the learned ability to weep in the morning and organize the kitchen cupboards in the afternoon and do both things honestly without the one cancelling the other. The house was a semi-detached in a suburb of a city in the north of England. Her mother, whose name was Margaret, had lived in it for 41 years. 41 years is a long time to live in a house. It is long enough for the house to become an extension of the person, for the particular way they organized things to be written into every drawer and every shelf and every cupboard, for the objects they kept to be a kind of autobiography of the choices they made and the things they loved and the people they held on to and the past they could not bring themselves to let go. Vera had been in this house thousands of times. She thought she knew it completely. She was discovering, in the sorting of it, that she had known it the way you know the surface of something, the daily visible surface, without knowing the interior, the accumulated and carefully kept interior of a woman who had never thrown anything away if the anything had ever mattered. The key was in a tin. The tin was on the highest shelf of the wardrobe in the back bedroom, the room that had been Vera's room when she was a child and that her mother had kept as a spare room after Vera left, maintaining in it a quality of preserved girlhood that Vera had always found touching and slightly uncomfortable in equal measure. The tin was old, biscuit tin, the kind with a painted lid showing a pastoral English scene that had faded to approximate pastel, the kind that had been repurposed from its original function decades ago and pressed into service as a keeper of things too small and too miscellaneous for a proper box but too important to be thrown into a drawer with everything else. Inside the tin was a collection of small objects that Vera sorted through with the careful attention of a person who understands that her mother had found these things worth keeping and that worth keeping means something even when the meaning is not immediately legible. A button. 2 foreign coins. A folded prayer card from a funeral. A lock of hair tied with faded pink thread. A small photograph, unmounted, of a woman Vera did not recognize standing in front of a building she did not recognize, looking at something outside the frame. And the key. It was large by modern standards, long-shafted, heavy, with the ornate bow that older keys have, the kind that fits a lock you would recognize as a lock from across the room. It was made of iron that had darkened with age to a deep grey-black, worn bright at the places it had been held most often, the bow and the top of the shaft where a thumb would have rested in the turning. It was substantial. It had weight in the hand that spoke of genuine age. It was not a decorative reproduction. It was the real thing. It was a key that had opened something. Vera held it for a long time. She did not know what it opened. She did not recognize it from anything in her mother's present life or from any lock in this house, which had ordinary modern locks and ordinary modern keys and nothing that this key could have fit. It was a key from somewhere else. From some previous chapter of her mother's life that Vera knew about in outline and not in detail, the before of Margaret's life, the life that existed before the semi-detached in the suburb, before Vera herself, before the 41 years that the house contained. The life that Margaret had spoken about rarely and carefully and always in the past tense, with the specific, deliberate past tenseness of someone who has decided that a previous chapter is closed and intends it to remain so. Vera put the key in her coat pocket. Not as a decision, she did not decide, she simply pocketed it the way you pocket something that you are not ready to put down and are not ready to examine and that you need to carry a little longer before you know what to do with it. She went home with it in her pocket and it sat on her kitchen table that evening while she ate a supper she did not particularly taste and while she looked at it and while she thought about her mother and about the things her mother had kept and about the things her mother had not said. Her mother had not said a great deal about her early life. There had been a town in Eastern Europe. Margaret had come to England in the late 1960s as a young woman, had come with a friend, had met Vera's father within 2 years of arriving, had married, had made her life here with the specific and committed thoroughness of a person who has decided that here is where the life is going to be and has organized themselves accordingly. She had been a good wife and a good mother and a good neighbor and a committed member of her church and a reliable presence at the school events and the community functions that constituted the social fabric of the suburb. She had been, by every measure of the life she had chosen to live, successful at living it. She had spoken about her childhood town occasionally, with a warmth that contained something else, something that Vera had noticed and had not pressed on, because pressing on things that a parent is carrying carefully is a specific kind of intrusion that children tend not to make, out of an instinctive respect for the weight that is clearly being managed. The key was from the town. Vera knew this without knowing how she knew it. She knew it the way you know certain things about a parent, not through information but through the accumulated understanding of decades of proximity, the knowledge that builds in the silences and the careful phrasings and the things that are always spoken about in one way and never in another. The key was from before. From the town. From whatever the town had contained that her mother had locked up carefully when she left it and had kept locked, literally and in every other sense, for the rest of her life. She did not sleep well that night. She thought about her mother. She thought about the town, which she had visited once, with her mother, when Vera was 11 years old, a trip that had been presented as a practical matter, something about family business, and that had been conducted with a quality of controlled emotion from her mother that Vera had noticed and had not understood and that she now, 41 years later and with the key on her kitchen table, began to understand differently. She thought about the woman in the photograph, who she did not recognize and who was looking at something outside the frame with an expression that Vera could not interpret at the distance of a photograph taken decades ago but that she thought, lying awake at 1 in the morning, might have been longing. She decided to go to the town. This decision was more complicated than it sounds. Vera had a life. She had work, she was a librarian, had been a librarian for 23 years, a job that suited her in the specific way that jobs suit people who are genuinely constituted for them rather than people who have simply arrived at them by the process of available opportunities and practical choices. She had her flat, which was hers in the specific way of a flat that has been lived in alone for long enough that every choice in it is your own choice and the ownership of it is not merely legal but genuine and daily. She had routines and friendships and the quiet, reliable infrastructure of a self-sufficient life that did not have obvious space for a spontaneous trip to Eastern Europe based on a key from a biscuit tin. She went anyway. She arranged the time. She packed for a week. She took the key, which went into her jacket pocket and stayed there. Not in her bag, not in her luggage, in her pocket, where she could feel its weight against her hip as she walked, which she found she wanted to be able to feel. She flew to the nearest airport and took a train and then a bus and arrived in the town on a grey afternoon in November that was, despite its greyness, immediately recognizable from the single childhood visit 40 years earlier. The market square, the church with its particular steeple, the proportions of the streets, which were European in a way that was specific to a particular latitude and a particular century of building. She did not know what she was looking for. She knew she was looking. She walked the town for 2 days with the key in her pocket and the photograph of the unknown woman in her bag and the particular alert, open attention of someone who has arrived somewhere without a clear purpose and who is trusting that the purpose will declare itself if the attention is genuine enough. On the second afternoon, she found the building in the photograph. She found it by walking, which is the only way you find things that you do not know you are looking for, by covering the ground and letting the ground offer what it has. The building was still standing, which was not obvious. Buildings from the photographs of the 1960s are sometimes not still standing, have sometimes been replaced by the practical requirements of subsequent decades. This one was standing. It was a residential building of 4 stories, stone-built, older than the photograph, maintained in the way that buildings are maintained when they are inhabited and used. It had a heavy front door with an ornate lock above the handle. She stood in front of it for a moment. She took the key from her pocket. She looked at the key and she looked at the lock, and the proportions were right in the specific way of things that fit each other, not obviously, not from a distance, but with the quiet correctness of 2 things that were made for each other and that the decades between them had not fundamentally altered. She was not going to put the key in the lock. She understood this. The building was not her building. The lock was not her lock. Whatever this key opened was not available to be opened by her. She was not the right person. The door was not hers to open. The things that lay on the other side of it belonged to a story she was only a part of through inheritance rather than through direct experience. But she stood in front of the building and she held the key in her hand, and she felt, with the specific and unmistakable feeling of something being understood that had not previously been understood, what the key was. It was not a key to a building. It was a key to her mother. Margaret had kept this key for 41 years in a biscuit tin on the highest shelf of a wardrobe in the room that had been her daughter's childhood bedroom. She had kept it without explanation and without the sharing of its meaning, which was a form of keeping to herself something that she had decided was hers to keep and that she had perhaps not known how to share, or had not wanted to burden her daughter with, or had simply not found the right moment and had continued not finding it until the moments were gone. She had left England as a young woman, and she had made a full and committed and genuinely lived life in England, and she had kept, in the tin on the highest shelf, this piece of the life she had left, this weight of iron, worn bright where she had held it, from a door in a town she had not gone back to after the single practical visit with the 11-year-old Vera. She had held the key. For 41 years she had, at some frequency and some private moment, taken the key from the tin and held it. Vera knew this from the wear on it. The wearing of metal requires the friction of handling, and the places where the key was worn smooth were the places that a hand holds a key when it is holding it rather than using it. Her mother had held this key the way you hold something that connects you to something you have left and cannot go back to. As an object of remembrance. As a physical link to a part of herself that the life she had built in England had no room to express, but that had continued, in the tin on the highest shelf, to exist. Vera stood in front of the building and she thought about her mother, and she felt the grief that had been waiting, behind the practical competence of the previous 3 weeks, to be fully felt. She felt it in front of the building in the town her mother had left before Vera was born, holding a key that her mother had carried across 41 years of a life built in another country, and the feeling was large and specific and honest in the way that grief is honest when the thing doing the grieving is not just the death but the distance between 2 people who loved each other and who had been, across the entirety of their relationship, separated by a self that one of them had kept in a tin on a high shelf and that the other had known about only in outline and never in detail. She found, in the records office of the town, information about her mother's family, information that her mother had not given her and that she had not known to ask for. A father who had died young. An older sister who had emigrated to Canada in the 1950s and whose descendants were, according to what the records office could provide, still there. A building registered to a family with her mother's maiden name. An early chapter of a life that had been carefully separated from the later chapter, and that turned out, now that Vera could see it, to be the root of the later chapter. The thing the later chapter had grown from, visibly, once you knew where to look. She contacted the Canadian family. This required time and effort and the careful navigation of reaching out to people who did not know her and who might or might not be interested in being known by her. They were interested. They were, it turned out, very interested. They had known about Margaret, had known she had gone to England, had lost contact and had not recovered it, had wondered for decades about the cousin their mother had spoken about with the specific warmth of someone who had loved a person and lost them to circumstance rather than choice. There was a daughter in Toronto who was 58 years old and who had her mother's eyes and who video called Vera on a Tuesday evening and who looked at Vera and said, quietly and with the particular warmth of recognition between people who share blood they have not previously met, "I have been wondering about you my whole life." Vera did not have language for this immediately. She had found, in the process of clearing her mother's house, a family she had not known she had. Not a replacement for the mother she had lost. Not a healing of the specific loss of the specific person who had been her mother. But something that had been locked for 41 years by a woman who had perhaps not understood what she was locking away when she made the decision to keep that part of herself in a tin on the highest shelf. A connection. A continuity. A route that went deeper than Vera had known her own story went. She kept the key. It sits on her kitchen table now, not in a drawer and not on a shelf, on the table, in the place where things are placed that are meant to be seen and thought about and not put away. She looks at it in the mornings with her coffee. She thinks about her mother when she looks at it, about what the key represented to Margaret, about what it cost her to carry it across 41 years, about the person her mother was in the part of herself that did not fit in the life she had built and that she had kept anyway, privately, in the weight of iron worn smooth by decades of holding. She thinks about what the key taught her. Not about her mother, though it taught her a great deal about her mother. About herself. About the things she was keeping locked in her own high shelves, the parts of herself that did not fit in the organized, self-sufficient, librarian's life that she had built with the same committed thoroughness with which her mother had built her suburban life. The parts that were real and that she had found no room for and that she had been keeping in the equivalent of tins on the equivalent of high shelves, unexamined, waiting for the moment when the right object in the right pocket prompted the right kind of looking. She began to look. She does not know yet everything that she will find. She knows the Canadian cousin, whose name is Christine and who visited last spring and who sat in Vera's flat with tea and talked for 2 days with the specific ease of people who are strangers in their history and not strangers in their essential nature. She knows more of her own story than she knew before. She knows that a life that has been built well can still be built further, that practical and self-sufficient and organized are not the same as complete, and that complete is not even the right word, because the self is not a project that reaches completion but a territory that can always be explored more deeply by a person willing to look at what they have been keeping locked. The key opened nothing. The key opened everything. It did not fit any lock that Vera found in the town, which had the particular and appropriate rightness of a thing that was never about the lock. It was about the carrying. About what a person keeps and what the keeping says about them. About what we inherit from the people who loved us, not just the things they put in tins on high shelves but the things they kept inside themselves and the things those kept things tell us, when we finally find them, about who they were before we knew them and therefore about who we are in the parts of ourselves that preceded our own knowing. She was 52 years old and she was beginning. Not starting over. Beginning is different from starting over. Beginning is what you do when you have been where you have been and you have found something in the going through it that opens a direction that was not previously visible. When a key in a biscuit tin in a dead woman's wardrobe leads you to a town and a building and a family and a cousin and a version of yourself that has been waiting, with the patient, worn brightness of a thing that has been held by hands that loved it, for exactly this moment. She began.